Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. I want to welcome everybody to this special Intimate Judaism Facebook Live. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
I'm Tali Rosenbaum.
And Tali, why don't you explain why we're doing this today, what this is about, and then I'll take it from there.
You know, I'm not even really sure, but I just noticed that in the past few days, my social media just blew up reading about this mikveh strike or sex strike. It was Eliza, your wife, who said we must talk about it. So I've been kind of going into social media to kind of see what this was about, and we are going to talk about it.
I'll ask you first. Can you say what exactly this sex strike is, unless you want me to explain it right now?
Well, from what I understand, Adina Miles, who is this amazing influencer, has been working very hard on helping to free women who are agunot. And what she's done is called for this particular Aguna Malki, whose husband is not giving her a get. She's been waiting for a get for 4 years. She's called on women to do a strike, not go to the mikvah or not have sex on Friday night in order to get this moving, in order to, I guess, somehow influence rabbis or have their husbands influence rabbis or get something moving in order to help free Malki and get her get. I hope I got that right. And also what I've been noticing on social media is an incredible amount of talk about this and an uproar about it. I mean, I think that she has done this in order to move things along. It seems to have moved something because I've never seen as much. I mean, I wish I would see as much outrage about the fact that there are agunot and the fact that Malki is waiting for 4 years for a get. The fact that we're seeing so much outrage about this strike. Why haven't we seen all this outrage about the fact that there are still agunot? It's really sad.
I definitely agree with that. And I just will add that I think that she specifically, if I understand correctly, it could be that I'm getting something wrong in terms of some of the details. I believe she wants to make a bigger sex or mikveh strike, but as a starting point, she had this past Friday night, a one-day mitzvah night strike. There is an idea that it's a mitzvah to have sex on Friday night. So she said, we're going to skip the mitzvah night this week, if I understand correctly. And that was a prelude, almost an experiment, I think she said, to see what would happen and then perhaps make something bigger at a later date. So it sort of already happened, but even though it already happened, it also was a prelude to perhaps a movement to do something more and to continue it. I'd like to add, Tali, to that first of all, second what you said, that I think that Adina deserves an awful lot of credit for putting this on an agenda in a way that it hadn't been on people's agenda beforehand. The Aguna problem is a serious crisis. There are lots of women who are chained, evil men who will not give a get. It's a terrible, terrible situation, and something must be done. Now, I don't know what that something is, and we'll get to that eventually in this Facebook Live, but something has to be done, and the first aspect is getting people to care about it and to make sure that people actually know that this is going on. So in that sense, by doing something which is radical and quote unquote crazy, like having a sex strike, certainly a good way to get people's attention, and it did. And in that sense, Adina deserves a huge amount of credit simply for the PR success of making the entire Orthodox Jewish world talk about a problem that in some ways we sweep under the carpet too often. So I want to point that out. I'm going to be very clear that I actually don't agree with the concept of a sex strike. I don't know what you think, Tali. We discussed this briefly, but didn't say so much of our own opinions in order to save it for this conversation and make it real. But I do think that she deserves credit, first of all, because that has to be pointed out. So I'm simply seconding your point in terms of her ability as a PR specialist, as an influencer, to use that influence in a positive way. I'll also add something else, which I think is important. I know that some people have criticized Adina. I've seen this on several WhatsApp groups and other places. They say, well, she's getting paid for this. She's raising money for it. She's gotten paid for trying to free Agunot in the past. And to me, that is not a valid criticism. I think when people do important work and spend their time trying to do whatever it is they're trying to do, there's no reason that a lawyer or a doctor or anybody else should be paid for his or her work. And somebody who's working to free Agunot needs to do it on a volunteer basis or else it's invalid. So the fact that she's been criticized for taking money is not an inherent criticism. Obviously, you need to have transparency. Obviously, we have to know where the money goes. I don't know anything about that, so I'm not even commenting on that. But the fact that she's being paid and some people think, therefore, that's some sort of scandal, I think is absurd. That is not a reason to undo what she's doing. And the final thing I'll make in terms of this opening positive aspect of what's going on, there's also a lot of talk about the halachic propriety of withholding sex a woman saying to her husband that they can't have sex on Friday night or any other time. And while there are halachic issues, the bottom line is that I think that the concept of this being a halachic problem, at least as I understand it, is quite overblown. Number one, all sex between a couple or anybody else for that matter requires consent or else it's not valid. That includes a married couple. So a woman saying to her husband at any point, I don't want to have sex tonight, or vice versa, is a reason that there can't be sex. They can't have intercourse that night. So if a woman is saying, I don't want it tonight, the fact that it's for a different reason than normal, it's not because she has a headache, it's because she wants to free agunot. It has to be consensual. If she's not in the mood, then it doesn't matter why. She can't do it. There is a concept in Halacha, Masachet Ketubot in the Mishnah, as well as in the 14th parak of Hilchot Ishut in the Rambam, about a moredet, a woman who is rebelling against her husband. People can look up the Rambam in the 14th parak of Ishut. I just think that the concept of this being some sort of halachic issue is really grasping at straws. This is not what's really going on over here. For a one night, sex strike, to call that a moredet, there's all sorts of reasons why I think calling it that is really overblown in my opinion.
Look, if a woman needs to withhold sex to get heard, and if women in a macro way need to withhold sex in order to be heard, there's an inherent problem. I mean, and what you're saying about consent, I think that the assumption that you have is if you don't want to have sex on Friday night, then, you just say, I don't want to have sex. And I think that what we might not be understanding is that in the cultural context that we're talking about here, this may be news. It may be news to women that they can say no to sex. So that's one thing I want to say about that. Look, I think that if couples decided together, the man and the woman, and they came together and they said, we're going to decide not to be together on Friday night as a way to make a statement to the rabbis, whatever that means, air quotes for whoever's not seeing me, in order to try to push this forward. I don't exactly know why it would, but let's just say enough rabbis and, college teachers and people out there are uncomfortable about the idea of couples not getting together on a Friday night. But a man and a woman get together and say, we need to do something to help these agunot. So let's deprive ourselves of one night of pleasure in order to make a statement. That's something very different. But if women are, as a group, trying to weaponize their sexuality in order to make a statement, or are purposefully withholding sex in order to get their husbands to move forward, I would ask myself, why do they have to do that? Like, why? It's got to be pretty desperate if you feel that you can't ask him to help. Why do you need to do that? I mean, that's really more bothersome to me. It shouldn't really bother us so much if a couple decides not to have sex one night. I mean, it's very, very private. It's a private thing. I think also the kind of making it so public is something that is also a source of discomfort for many.
I think that's true. In fact, a lot of what you said right now, Tali, leads to some of the reasons and alludes to some of the reasons that on a personal level, I think that this is not necessarily a good idea. I think the motivation is good, but I think that this particular idea of a sex strike is not necessarily a good idea, despite the fact, as I said, it's coming from a good place. So I'm going to throw out several of the reasons that I find it problematic, and I'd like you to comment on them. Perhaps you have your own reasons that you agree or disagree with what I'm about to mention. The first one is that, as I understand it, and you certainly have a lot more to say about this than I do, but the idea of withholding sex is itself often seen as a form of abuse. To use sex as a point of leverage is a form of abuse, or maybe a sign of an abusive relationship. I don't know which one is the more technically correct term. Either way, though, it's associated with abuse. And as a result of that, I don't like the idea of fighting abuse, one kind of abuse, with something else, which also is a form of abuse. And because of that, people can obviously say to anything I say, freeing agunot is more important than anything I say now, and maybe they're right. But from my perspective, whatever method we use shouldn't be what's inherently an abusive or an abusive adjacent type of methodology. What's your opinion about that?
Well, in order to say that something is abusive, then somebody needs to have more power over the other person. And in this case, I think that the pervasive leverage and abuse of women due to the way that the get situation is, the way that women are not able to free themselves in the way that they're not being freed, not by their husbands and not by the rabbis, that's really the abuse. I mean, let's look at the real abuse. There is systemic abuse in the fact that women can't get out of a marriage the same way that their male partner can get out of the marriage. So they're inherently hierarchically in a subordinate position. So yes, if there was a one-up position, if the woman had more power and she used that power to withhold sex and she's doing it in a very cruel way, then I think that you can make a case that the behavior is abusive. I wouldn't call it abusive in this case. I would really call it very desperate. Do I think that it's healthy? No. Do I think that it's generally in relationships a good idea to withhold sex in order to get what you want? I also don't think it's a good idea to necessarily give sex in order to get what you want. I don't think that using sex as a resource that you provide or that you hold back on in order to get what you want is, on a relational level, a very good idea. So that's correct. But I think in this case, to compare the woman's abuse by just saying for one night, for the sake of Malki, we're not going to have sex, and to compare that to the pervasive general abuse of a system that doesn't allow women to get out of a marriage because they're suffering when they're suffering. And the system is often used to blackmail women into a great deal of money that they'll do anything just to get their get. I don't know that we can weigh them or balance them in any kind of equal way. But your point about it not being a good or nice or relational thing to do, I completely agree with.
You see, Tali, the reason that I don't fully agree with you on this case is that it sounds almost like you're comparing the abuse of a husband withholding a get from his wife, which is awful and huge, to the obviously, if we want to call it abuse, much smaller abuse of one night, a woman telling her husband, you can't have sex tonight with me. Obviously, those aren't comparable. But the imbalance is not between the person withholding the get and the woman now telling her husband she can't have sex. In that relationship, we're talking about between the woman who's going on the quote unquote sex strike, a perfectly healthy marriage. There's no imbalance inherently there in terms of their personal relationship, hopefully, Bezrat Hashem. It's a regular relationship, and she's creating an imbalance. And by the way, that will get to my second point, the second thing I don't like about it, that she's creating that imbalance. In other words, she's not the one who's trying to get a get and therefore trying to retake power. This is somebody who, to make a statement, is taking what should be an equal relationship and asserting dominance, asserting a type of power and saying, I'm going to hold it back from you. And I'll use that as an introduction to my second problem, which is, apart from the weaponization of intimacy, along with that, I think that there's a problematic message, which you alluded to as well, which is that sex is something which the wife holds in her hand and she can dispense it or not dispense it, to withhold it at will, meaning the concept of sex as a transaction, as something which, to use a term which probably doesn't exist, almost prostitutional. That's not a healthy way of looking at sex. Now, once again, I'm going to say it again because I think it's important. Anything I say, someone can say, who cares about a tiny message like that compared to the big problem of agunot? I don't have an answer to that. But in terms of this particular method of trying to get people's attention, the idea of teaching people and treating sex like something which is transactional, as you said before, I think that's problematic as well.
I agree with you that transactional sex is problematic. I also think what's really problematic is the belief that the only power that the woman has at her disposal, or that women have at their disposal, is the power of their sexuality, that there is no way in which that they can have any influence or have any say unless they hold back on sex. And that's actually kind of like this almost ironic flip, in that there really isn't anything very feminist about it. It's really just kind of like an answer to the patriarchy, which really only stresses that this is such a patriarchal system that we have nothing that we can do here except for withhold sex. That kind of doesn't ring positively. But on the other hand, what am I doing to help free agunot? Like, I'm not doing anything. And a lot of people who are complaining about this are also not doing anything or doing much. And here something's being done. And again, maybe this will do something because everybody's talking about it. Do I think that it's like a good thing to do, lechatchila, like to begin with? No, I don't think so, because for all the reasons that we've so far mentioned, I think we're in agreement about why it's not a really good road to go down. But then another part of me says, well, apparently desperate situations demand desperate measures. I don't want to trash the whole idea. I just want to point out how strongly people are reacting to this. And also, how come people aren't reacting as strongly to the presence of this aguna issue?
Okay, that's a very good point. In fact, it leads, though, to my next point, which is when you say it's not a good road to go down, but on the other hand, what am I doing? What are we all doing? Maybe something has to be done. To which I answer, and this might be ignorance on my part. It could be there actually is an end game that I just don't understand. But from the research that I've done, and I can't say it's been that extensive, I don't really understand what the end goal is over here. In other words, let's say that this caught on among a large segment of the population such that it actually happened, that a large number of people, maybe on Friday night or maybe for a longer period of time, I don't know what that long-term goal is, didn't have sex. What's that supposed to do? Is that supposed to convince husbands to get more involved? Okay, doing what? By protesting in front of the Get Withholding Husband's house? Okay, maybe. That's possible. I kind of got the feeling, though, that it's there in order to convince the husbands to convince the rabbis to do something. And I think this leads into a problem in terms of understanding what that means, the rabbis. I should point out, there's no such thing as the rabbis. There's no Beit Din HaGadol anymore. We don't have a Sanhedrin. The rabbis doesn't exist as an institution. There's no papacy where by fiat someone can say, well, I'm changing the rule. I'm sure Catholics wouldn't agree with that comparison. But what I mean is that it's not like the rabbi has a tool in his toolbox that he thinks he can use, and only if people convinced him and made his life difficult enough, that rabbi would, fine, I'm taking out the tool of Bittul Kiddushin or who knows what, whatever the specific tool he has in mind is, and use that tool. I have a hard time believing that that's what's really going on over here. So let me just say that in terms of an end game, what exactly is supposed to happen? And I'll say one more point than that, and there's a lot more we can say about this particular point. If we're talking about the communities where Adina doesn't have influence, and there are communities where she doesn't have influence, such as I assume, for example, the Satmar community and some various other communities in upstate New York, well, how is this going to help by convincing people in other communities? The rabbis in that community wouldn't care. Moreover, the rabbis in these other communities where maybe she does have influence, I don't think that people like Rav Shechter and Rav Willig, who are involved in the centrist Orthodox community, pressure is going to change their halachic psak. They are doing what they can with organizations like ORA and various other organizations out there. I don't think that the problem is they haven't been pressured enough. I'm not saying everyone's doing as much as they can. I have no idea. But I just don't see what that can possibly do that will actually convince the rabbis to change their psak. If people don't like that psak, they can either get different gedolim, I'm serious, or they can leave orthodoxy, or they can ignore the halacha. But to get someone who believes that this is the only method to somehow change his mind, I don't think that's how these posts can work.
I hear what you're saying. Look, I don't know what the rabbis could do more, but I have a feeling they could do more. I'm sure that they could do more, and they're not. I mean, for example, no rabbi should marry a couple without a prenup. And even couples who are already married should be encouraged to go get postnups. There are ways, there are halachic ways. And the fact that they're not being implemented is the problem, not so much the fact that some women decided not to have sex with their husbands Friday night. And by the way, sex with your husband on Friday night or any other night is not their entitlement. What kind of bothers me is this assumption that we're going to take something away from you that really does belong to you, but we're not going to give it to you. And that's kind of like a corruption of what sexual intimacy is supposed to be. This idea that this is something that I give you because it's magia lecha, it's really yours. You're supposed to get it. I'm not allowed to say no. I've never said no. And suddenly Adina gives me permission to say no. And if there is something good that might come out of this, it's this idea that, well, no, that's not a given, but it's not something that you strike about. It's something that you talk about. You know, I think that we have to understand that in some communities, there may not be enough discussion of intimacy as consensual or not an entitlement. And in that particular community, if there's really that kind of situation where Friday night is mitzvah night, and if the woman has gone to the mikvah and she's available to her husband, she has to have sex. And I can tell you as a sex therapist, as a relational therapist, from my work, that I have seen women who really never were told that It's about whether or not they want to. Women will talk about how exhausted they are on Friday night, and all they want to do is drink some wine, go to sleep, and that just going to sleep on a Friday night is not an option for them. I mean, these are the things that we need to be talking about, even though I know that we're here to talk about kind of like weaponization of sex, which is, I don't think it's a good thing.
So once again, I come back to that same idea because I do agree with what you're saying. I do wonder, however, if the people who aren't getting that message largely are the same people who are turned on by the sex strike, by, yeah, let's do that. Or those are the people who already know that they are allowed to say no. In other words, I don't necessarily know that the people who need that message are the ones who are hearing the message. The people who do hear the message probably, at least partially, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, already know that message. And the fact is, I don't know who listens to Adina Miles. It's not something which I'm aware of.
Well,
It
why
could.
don't we ask? I mean, I would like to ask, like, why is everyone so upset? In other words, like, what is everybody getting so upset about? If a woman wants to not have sex with her husband, if she really doesn't want to, or if she doesn't feel well, or if she's tired, or if she's not in the mood, I mean, these are all, at least on a personal level, completely legitimate things. But why is there this outrage, this uproar? Like, what is this about? You have to wonder, why are people so upset about it's almost like, wait a second, you're taking away what I deserve? Is that the message? Because again, it's not your entitlement. Look, I understand parts of why people are upset because that idea, again, I've said this over and over again, it's to me, it's kind of anti-feminist, this idea. But on the other hand, I don't want to knock it down because I do have a lot of respect for the movement of trying to help Agunot. With that, I think we have to acknowledge that there are a lot of different reasons that people feel. Again, we didn't even say this, but people all over the internet, all over social media, mostly like the more rabbinic or Jewish leaders, are talking about this idea of how can we go ahead and destroy more marriages and destroy more homes and Shlom Bayit, and what would it do to Shlom Bayit? See, that's not how I see it. I see it as working in a way that couples decide together. If one night of a sex strike is destroying your Shlom Bayit, there's a big question there, like what's going on in your relationship? What's going on in your marriage? Who are you punishing? Who are you doing this? I don't think I agree that women should not be punishing their husbands unless, and we don't know this might be happening, their husbands are in the carpool with this guy, this get refuser, and they're friends with him and they're learning with him and they're sending him up for an aliyah. Like if there's a situation, and this is where there's a possible place really for a mikvah strike, is when these women's husbands, you're in a community, and these women's husbands are supporting the get refuser. And you're trying to tell them, and I wish that they could just say to them, hey, Beryl or Shmuel or whatever, would you, listen to me? This guy's not giving his wife a get. Can you talk to him and try to convince him to give his wife a get? Like that should be enough. But in communities where it's apparently not enough, maybe this would do something. Again, I'm not a big fan of this whole idea, as you can tell. I'm really trying to give it kind of a positive spin because who knows if it helps this woman, then, whatever. But I think that there should be better ways, and there should be better ways to avoid this whole problem to begin with.
I agree. And the reason that I don't think that's accurate, what you just said, not because what you're saying isn't true, meaning if this were directed at the wives of the people who are enabling the get refusers, then for sure, I really do understand what's going on there. I don't know what's going on in Adina's head. I'm not an expert in this at all. I did watch a few of her Instagram videos in order to prepare for this. And it sounded to me, and it could be someone will say you completely misunderstood that, in which case I'm open to that criticism. It sounded to me that she was, number one, speaking to all women. And number two, it sounded to me that she was doing what I said in my second point before, namely the wife saying, not tonight. No, you can't have it. That was the attitude, at least, that came across. Now, she's an entertainer. It could be that's the way she said it without actually meaning it like that. But to my ears, it came across as, no, not tonight, honey. I'm holding it back. You can't get what you want because I'm not going to give it to you. That was the feeling and the impression that I got. So it wasn't, let's have a conversation. And if you're enabling a get refuser, then I'm going to have to take extreme measures. That's not the feeling I got. It was all of Am Yisrael has to do this in order to get the men to get off their chairs and finally get activated.
It's not only unfortunate message to women that their power is in their sexuality. But it's kind of an unfortunate message to men that they're only going to do what you want if you hold sex back from them. I mean, yeah, no, I hear that.
I agree with that.
Sex is not a resource that you give. It's not a service that you provide. It's really meant to be something that connects you and something that you both do together mutually. And if something good comes out of this, it's also being able to send those messages out that we don't use sex in that way. But again, I still keep wanting to go back to that point that leverage is being weaponized against women in a global way when it comes to the problem of aginut. And that where there's a problem of that level, I can't judge the behavior of the women who are being oppressed by this.
Absolutely. No, and that's not who's being judged here. The question is, are the people who are not involved in that particular case, is this the right way to protest? I want to go back to another point that I was making before, Tali, a little bit more, this concept of the rabbis a bit more, only because it sounds to me like there is a fundamental assumption underlying what Adina is trying to do of what is commonly said, when there's a halachic will, there's a halachic way, meaning if only they really cared enough, they could do something about this.
When there's a rabbinic will.
When there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way.
Yeah, okay. Lou Greenberg.
In other words, you mentioned before they should at least, for example, sign a prenup. I've gone to the Ora website and Rav Schechter is there in their video saying, sign the prenup. And I believe the RCA, at least as I understand it, won't perform marriages, at least officially, if you don't have a prenup. On some level, I'm not saying the prenup is the be-all and end-all and will solve all the problems. It doesn't solve all the problems. It solves a lot of problems, but doesn't solve all the problems. And then, of course, there are different questions. Which prenup, this prenup, that prenup. We're not done with the story, but things are being done. And this concept of, oh, they don't care at all, I don't think that's true. And I think there's certain idea that pressure is going to convince people whose lives are based on halacha. We might disagree with their halachic positions in any given case. That's fine. But I just don't believe that the people who actually are deciding these ideas, we're not talking about regular shul rabbis. Regular shul rabbis have no influence over here. The people who have the influence are the Gdolei Hador of any given community. Pressure doesn't work when it comes to these things. Let's say this were taking place in Israel, which it's not. Let's say it were taking place in Israel where the law of the land is halacha when it comes to marriage and divorce. In a situation like that, if someone said, we're going to have a sex strike in order to get the men mad, in order to push the politicians to change the law, say, okay, politicians are very different. They are definitely affected by public opinion. So whether that's a good idea or a bad idea is a different story. But the truth is that might be a really effective way of doing it. But trying to convince these rabbis who are, I just don't think that the rabbis who are making these decisions, particularly in a community that I am associated with and that you are associated with, I don't think they're going to be prone to pressure that because men are calling up and saying, my wife won't have sex, therefore, fine, I'm going to do something which I think is halachically invalid. I just don't buy it. I want to mention something else. I actually spoke to a neighbor who's a lawyer. And this gets to another problem that I think the sex strike might cause, which people may not have thought about, but there's a problem of nuance and there's a problem of unintended consequences. And this friend mentioned to me, he's a neighbor, he was talking about it with me and he said, the truth is that some of the men who refuse to give gittin and then they're harassed, quote unquote, by people protesting outside their houses, obviously justly and correctly, but they might sometimes go to court. They try and get an injunction against them. They try to sue them. There are all sorts of legal maneuvers that they make. And people in the legal community generally don't know anything about this order. They never heard of the word agunah. They don't know what's going on. Jewish divorce law, they don't know what's happening. This friend said, if they then Google the idea of agunah, and the first thing that comes up is sex strike, and they find out that the quote-unquote women who are against the quote-unquote men are just as crazy, they're doing these crazy things in the eye of the legal community, it actually could have long-term effects that could be very negative for other agunot. In other words, if in the legal community, the people who are protesting are seen as the normal, sane, kind, good people, and the people withholding the get are seen as they should be, as wicked, then the legal community can get behind that. But if the people who are protesting are seen as just as crazy, even if that's not fair, but if that's how they see it, then it can undermine various other attempts at getting a get. It can actually make them the courts rule in favor of some of the men. Now, I don't think this has happened, and I don't know if it will happen, but I think it's important to look at the concept of unintended consequences, things that we don't necessarily think about. When you go and do something radical, as I said at the beginning, it's great because it gets a lot of PR and it gets a lot of noise, and it's something which a lot of people are thinking about. But you never know where it might lead in terms of consequences that you didn't consider. And I just wanted to point that out because I don't know if this friend is accurate or not, if he's right or not. But I think it's worth mentioning that we don't necessarily know where this can go in terms of other agunot when it might actually end up being, strangely enough, a negative.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know that I really kind of relate to that. I think that we know that in order to affect change, social protest is a very known kind of tactic. I mean, a lot of changes occurred in the world when you think about different movements, freeing the slaves, or other movements that have created social change. Social protest is a well-known method. This idea of, well, it's easy to see the debt refusers as the bad guys, but if you do a sex strike, then suddenly the women advocating for agunot will be seen as crazy, then you're undermining. Look, I don't think that these women should be seen as crazy. I think that they're desperate. I think that it's a desperate thing to do, but the system has created that despair. The system has created that.
But Talia, I'm
And
not
I
saying they should be seen as
understand the
crazy.
legal implication.
I'm not talking about they should be seen as crazy.
This is what your neighbor said.
I'm not saying we should see them as crazy. I'm talking about a guy named, Chris Smith, who's a lawyer who sees this, who's asked to advocate on behalf of a guy, and he wants to find out what's going on. This guy's refusing a get, and he looks it up and sees that this community is striking against him by withholding sex. What is this craziness? That's the idea.
Well,
not that it should or not should not be seen that way.
Or he might say, wow, these poor women must be so oppressed that they don't have a voice, that they have no other way to create influence, that the only way that they have to create influence is to withhold sex for them. He might say that. He might not say they're crazy.
Okay. It's definitely possible. As I said, I'm repeating something which someone told me, someone who has legal knowledge, which I do not have. And I wanted to point that out.
It doesn't have any legal implications. I mean, there's nothing illegal about withholding sex. It might not be so relational. It might not be so great for your marriage. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, look.
We can't pretend the law is a computer where simply you type something in and something comes out and it's purely objective. It's based on the way the judge sees it, the way the jury sees it, the way that the lawyers see it, the way they understand what's going on. There's a lot of subjectivity that goes in there as well. I don't want to argue the point because I'm not a legal expert, so I don't know. I'm simply saying that there are unintended consequences in terms of the way that people perceive something, which might not always be as positive when you do something which is radical. On the other hand, as you said correctly,
Obviously, I mean, we're seeing that. We're seeing that within the Orthodox community from really both ends. Also, the feminists and the yotzot, and we're seeing that there isn't a great deal of support, but we're seeing it from people who aren't the ones suffering. At the end of the day, it's easy for us to talk about how beautiful marriages should be. I don't think we can judge people who are really, really desperate because there really is a sense of unfairness and oppression.
Tali, again, I agree with everything you said. I feel like you're conflating the people who are suffering as agunot versus the people doing the sex strike who are not. These are people they are doing it on behalf of those who are suffering, which, by the way, tremendous chesed is being done out of goodness of their heart. They're not doing it for any selfish reason whatsoever. It's purely an act of chesed. But they're not the ones who are desperate.
Yeah, no, look, I hear you. I hear you at the end of the day. Like, why would it matter if Huvi and Baruch are having sex on Friday night or not in Brooklyn? Like, I get that. I don't really understand that, but the outrage is what did it. The outrage, it really did bring attention to this get issue. And whether it's negative attention or positive attention, it did bring attention. It would be really unfortunate if women learn from this strike that, oh, wow, now I can get out of sex Friday night. Like this idea that in this day and age, there are women who still believe that sex is an obligation. I think that if we have an opportunity to invite people to listen to our episodes on intimate Judaism about how we believe that the Torah views sexuality, how it's supposed to be mutual and it's supposed to be consensual, and it should never be something that's taken for granted and should never be something that's used to punish. I think that in the end of the day is the ideal way that we want to be able to talk about this.
Yeah. Okay. I definitely agree with that. And certainly the idea that people need to have a better understanding, a better education when it comes to their rights. We did an episode about sexual rights one time, about
Sure.
rights and sexuality, as well as simply the concept of healthy sexuality. I think that, and before I want to undo an implication I might have given, which is that, certain communities have a very unhealthy view and other communities have a very healthy understanding. I think everyone needs more information. I don't think that any community is completely free of some of the problems that come with it. I just meant sort of in a general sense, but certainly all communities, right to left, need to have greater sexual education, I think, when it comes to these matters before they get married. Something that you and I have talked about extensively in terms of Khatan and Kala classes, that more needs to be done, more needs to be taught because people don't have all the information. And if what's going on now with this simply alerts people that there's more that is allowed or more that needs to be consensual, certainly that's a positive consequence of what's been going on.
Yeah, look, I think that we've spoken a lot on our podcasts about relationships and intimacy and how the opposite of that, conflict, can create hostility. And that also when couples are in conflict or they don't feel safe, we talked about this also with the war, that we go into fight, flight, freeze, or please, or the various mechanisms that we use to survive. I think that this get, refusal, and movement to free agunot, we're talking about survival. We're talking about women who are not able to get out of a marriage. They're like in prison and they are desperate. And what I have heard, that what resonates with me is when I hear, can't we decide as a couple, for the sake of supporting Malki and other agunot, decide that because you haven't been able to have pleasure with anybody for 4 years, can we take one night symbolically to kind of withhold our pleasure and make a statement that way? That, of course, is very different than this idea of taking the female population and creating this punishment to the male population at large and saying, it's the girls against the boys and all the power is in their hands. And now we're going to take the power by creating this global mass sex strike. I think that that's very, very different and that can create difficulties. But I do want to, again, just acknowledge that when you're in a state of survival, you're going to fight. Look, what we're doing in Gaza also is not, like what's happening now, we're fighting for our lives, we're fighting for our survival. And that's also not an ideal situation. It's really not.
Yeah, that's very true. I've given you the reasons that I'm not in favor of this sex strike in general, even as I agree with you that the PR, admittedly, the lawyer says it might not be so good, but on the whole, leaving that aside, the PR benefit of raising this issue and bringing it into the Orthodox world's public consciousness in a much greater way is a very positive thing. I mean, I don't know Adina personally. I've spoken to her a couple times on the phone, but not recently. But I assume that she would be the first to acknowledge that she is one of many people, admittedly perhaps the most high-profile person, but her work is being built on the work of many other individuals, other influencers, other organizations, which have also been working on the same issue. And more people need to be involved, but there are people other than Adina Miles who are working on it as well. And we should make sure that people know that she is not the only voice out there. And I would guess that she would be the first person to acknowledge that as well. There are lots of people who are doing a lot of important work on this. And even though more needs to be done and more people need to be made aware of it, there are people out there who are doing good work. And let's just assume that people know that already and will understand that there are good people and organizations out there which are worth supporting as well.
Yeah, I think that we definitely should support every organization that's out there that's doing work to help prevent. First of all, prevention. Prevention is super important with this. We have to really be aware and talk about the prenups and talk about red flags when getting engaged and talk about getting to know the person before you get married. Who are you marrying? And to talk about this idea of leverage in the first place, the idea of weaponizing intimacy and aspects of intimacy. This is really, really unfortunate kind of situation. And I don't know what the major organizations like ORA and other organizations that are there to help agunot, what they think about this sex strike. We've spent a lot of time this evening kind of talking about the pitfalls of it, kind of why it doesn't kind of ring well with the spirit of Jewish marriage and intimacy. It doesn't ring well in either of us. I think we have been in agreement about a lot of things here, But I also want to acknowledge that neither does the Agunah situation ring well with what Jewish intimacy is supposed to be. I don't believe that men were ever supposed to use this to leverage and weaponize. And the whole discussion kind of reminds me a little bit of when we were talking about the surrendered wife and we were talking about the book, and people were talking about what an amazing book it was, and we didn't think it was so amazing. But what we did say is that there are situations where you might be married to somebody who is narcissistic or abusive, and if you can't get out of that marriage or you choose not to get out of that marriage, well, maybe kind of acting in accordance with certain principles will help you kind of stay in, that it's a strategy. And strategies are not always ideal. They're strategies because you're trying to survive. And I think that that's what's happening here. And we need to acknowledge that, even though I think many people will agree with the potential difficulties in it and how it's not really in the spirit of what intimacy is really about. It's not about threats. It's not about withholding sex or promising sex to get something.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're in agreement on that point, Tali, as well as on most of the points, I think, tonight. I think we have certainly not exhausted a very important and complicated topic, but offered some thoughts, perhaps some Rosh Prakim, some chapter headings, so that this can give some food for thought, maybe for further discussion. So thank you for joining me tonight.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure talking to you, Scott.